In this lecture, we'll be focusing on community ecology with three objectives to cover. We'll take a look at species interactions, trophic roles and relationships, and then finally, energy flow through ecosystems. Let's begin by discussing species interactions. And the first thing we'll take a look at is competition, which is really an interaction between two organisms as they are going after a shared limited resource. There's a couple of forms of competition. There's intra-specific competition, which is among members of the same species. And so we can see these two competing mammals here are measuring each other up for dominance, likely to win the favor of mates. Interspecific competition will occur between members of different species. And here we can see these lions have made a kill, and the jackals, or hyenas, excuse me, are coming in and taking their share. So there's competition there. And this can be quite stressful for predators because they use a lot of energy to make these kills, and they need to replenish those energy stores with the food that they have captured. So for the hyenas to come in and steal biomass and energy, that can be quite harmful in some cases, depending on the limitations of the resource. It's also interesting to point out that plants compete quite a bit. So plants tend to get ignored in terms of behavior and interactions with living things and each other, but they do compete, just much more on a slower pace than we are typically observing in nature. When plants grow, they are most definitely competing for space, as you can tell by the plants, this aerial view of the trees and plants in a rainforest. But then they're also competing for light. And so some plants will grow taller to try to get to the top of the canopy to get more light. Others will have broad leaves to acquire as much light as possible and shade out other competitors. And some are designed to just be able to tolerate lower levels of light than other plants. When competition occurs, there is something known as a competitive exclusion principle, which is a theory that no two populations can occupy the same niche and compete for the same resource in the same habitat. So what ends up happening is one ends up being excluded. Let's look at the classic example of what this may look like in a laboratory or in an aquatic ecosystem. Here we're looking at a protozoan, a unicellular protozoan known as a paramecium. We'll look at two different species. So in this first data set, you'll see there's Paramecium aurelia. So this is basically the population growth curve of this one paramecium without any competitors. In a second experiment, we went ahead and grew Paramecium caudatum. And again, it's a Paramecea, but it's one of the Paramecea species, but it's just a different one than the Aurelia. So notice here is its growth pattern when it is grown in isolation, no other competitors. Now, when we grow these two Paramecea together in one culture, something interesting happens. Aurelia outcompetes caudatum, and caudatum eventually is competitively excluded because they're going after the same resources here, and competition results. And Aurelia, even though it's smaller than caudatum, is better at acquiring those nutrients, and again leads to the competitive exclusion of caudatum after a period of about a month or 35 days. So this can happen with larger species as well. We can see that when you can't have two apex predators going after the same resource or occupying the same niche in the same habitat. One of the interesting things we're seeing along the stretches of northern Canada is as the sea ice is melting because of climate change, polar bears have less hunting grounds out on the sea ice. They like sea ice, they can catch seals more easily. So the polar bears are migrating more onto the northern reaches of the tundra, and their niche or territory is kind of overlapping with grizzlies. grizzly bears. So that would mean you'd have two apex bears trying to go after the same resource, and that typically leads to competitive exclusion. One of the concerns we have for polar bears is that they're now faced with new stresses as a result of climate change. Interestingly, though, we have made some observations of grizzlies and polar bears recognizing each other as mates, and there's led to some hybrid species known as the Pizzly bear or roller bear. It depends on who's naming it, I guess. So interesting. That kind of leads to how nature finds a way to try to avoid the competitive exclusion principle, if possible. And another way that it will do that is what we call resource partitioning. So resource partitioning is where you would have normally competing species decide to divide up the ecosystem or the niche so that they can all exist. And so here we're going to look at warblers, which is a type of bird, and you can find their names here. And it's always amusing how ornithologists or bird scientists name these birds. But all of these warblers are essentially going after the same resource in pine trees. And what has happened is they've spatially divided up pine trees based on food availability and preference. The Cape May warbler tends to consume new needles and buds at the top of a tree, whereas the Blackburnian warbler will go for needles and buds in the upper branches, not necessarily the very top, but a little bit further down. So you can see there's a little niche overlap, but the Blackburnian warbler will kind of migrate lower onto the tree to feed if the Cape May warbler is present. The bay-breasted warbler, that tends to go for older needles. So notice its niche overlaps spatially with the Blackburnian warbler. So you can see there's some overlap here. But they go after older needles and lichens on the trunk rather than new needles. So even though they're occupying the same space, they're not going after the same exact resource. The yellow-rumped warbler is going after bare lichen or lichens or bare patches of the tree on the lower part. So it really kind of separates itself from the other three species to occupy the niche lower on the pine trees. We can also see that a shared resource can be divided up over time. An interesting example of resource partitioning can be seen in the savanna. When the grass grows after the peak rainy season in the savanna, you have very, very tall grass. Well, the tallest grazer, being the zebra, will come in and feed on that first, but it doesn't really eat the entire shoot or plant. It only eats it down to a certain level that's convenient for its height. Then it moves on. Well, a couple of months after that, the grasses are about a medium size, and wildebeests will come in. They're a little bit shorter than zebras, and they take their share. But again, they don't eat the entire shoot. They only graze down to where it's convenient, and you have these short little bits of grass left, and that's where the gazelles, the smallest of the grazers, will come in, and they will take their share. So again, this is based off of time, months after the peak rainy season, and also the anatomy and physiology of the grazers that are coming into the savanna to feed on these grasses. Now, moving away from competition, let's talk a little bit about symbiosis. Now, symbiosis is a close and long-term interaction between different species. And symbiosis, when people talk about it or use that term in our common vernacular, they're usually talking about mutualism, which is a type of symbiosis where both species benefit. But it's important to realize that a symbiotic relationship is not necessarily mutually beneficial. There are actually three forms of symbiosis that we're going to discuss in this course. And the first is parasitism. So this is a close and long-term interaction between two different species, where one species, the parasite, benefits at the expense or harm of the host. One of the gnarliest parasites in nature is this little isopod, I believe it is. I believe this is an isopod that will basically get into the mouth of a fish and replace its tongue and just hold on. And it becomes attached to the inside of the fish's mouth, and every time the fish eats, it gets a free meal. So you can see he's benefiting quite a bit. He gets a free meal every time the fish exerts energy to eat. The fish, you can see, is clearly harmed. This can lead to an infection. This compromises the amount of food it gets, not to mention the discomfort and pain. Now you may wonder, why does the fish let this happen? Well, fish don't have arms. They have these fins that can't really get any parasites out of their mouth. They can't brush their teeth or anything like that. So what's interesting about this parasitic relationship, it has led to one of the more interesting forms of mutualism. Mutualism is where both species benefit from their interaction. And so here in this animation, we're seeing what's called cleaning symbiosis. This is a cleaning wrasse, which is a type of fish and has very distinct markings with this broad band going down its side. And when a larger fish sees these, they actually open their mouth and allow the wrasse to go in and clean any parasites off of out of their mouth. So you may think, wait, that fish why isn't it eating the wrasse? Well, because the benefit of avoiding this parasite outweighs what it would get from the beneficial relationship here. So in fact, this cleaning symbiosis is so strong that as a diver, a human diver can go onto the reef, and when you see a cleaning wrasse, if you open your mouth, he'll come on in and clean your teeth for you. So pretty wild. There's also cleaner shrimp that do something similar. So cleaning symbiosis is very, very popular on coral reefs, but you'll also see it on land as well. With some species, hippos and other things will look for this interaction as well. Now, commensalism is the third type of symbiosis, where one species benefits and the host isn't harmed. They just seem unbothered. And I think the classic example of this is the remora, which is a very interesting fish that doesn't have a dorsal fin or a fin on the back of its top of its body. Instead, the dorsal fin is like a flattened suction cup. And they just attach to sharks or larger fish and get a free ride. Additionally, they get to eat the shark's scraps. The shark seems unbothered. There's been many studies here. They just simply don't seem to get away from the remoras. There's no effect on them whatsoever. And I can attest to this. One time while diving, a remora actually attached itself to my leg. It was pretty funny, and it didn't hurt. Just was there kind of holding on. So there's no pain associated with this. There's very minimal drag, and the sharks just seem to be perfectly fine with these things kind of tagging along here. Getting back to plants, it's also important to remember that plants can also have symbiotic relationships. Here is looking at the symbiotic relationship between roots of a plant and a certain type of fungus that grows within the root itself, and this can help the plant grow. So it's a mutualistic relationship, and often you won't find plant roots in the soil without like fungus growing along with them. We'll talk a little bit more about these perhaps later. They're known as mycorrhizal fungi. They really do help the plants to grow and acquire more nutrients. So a mutually beneficial relationship seen in plants and fungus. Let's now talk about predation, which I think is probably easy to define for you. Basically, you have a predator, which is an animal that goes after prey, which is the organism that is killed or eaten in the relationship. There's an interesting dynamic between these two, and it drives a lot of very, very important interactions. So you have, if we look at this graph here, we'll go ahead and uncover it. We're looking basically at the number of snowshoe hares and the population of lynx. The hare, of course, is the prey, and the lynx would be the predator. And so you'll notice there's an interesting correlation between the two, right? So first of all, when the snowshoe hares are able to grow in the absence of the lynx, their population spikes. Eventually it does crash due to various limited resources and so forth, but you can see the density of hare in the spring was quite high in 1980 when there was no predator available. When a predator was introduced here, the lynx was introduced in 1987, it looks like. Notice the population density of the hare did not go as high because you had the interaction of the predator controlling it. You'll also notice that it seems like the spikes in the two populations are almost in phase, but there's a little bit of a time delay. You'll have a spike in the prey population followed by a spike in the predator population. We're going to do a lab where we're going to simulate this and try to understand why this happens in nature. The relationship of predator and prey can also lead to effects on the whole food chain. What we're looking at here is an example of top-down regulation. This is a famous situation that occurred in Yellowstone National Park, and we're going to talk about this example time and time again in this course, where you have this top-down regulation that basically, when wolves were removed from Yellowstone, it led to an overpopulation of elk. And that increase in elk population, just like we saw here, if we remove the lynx, the prey population goes up. Well, elks feed on the trees, the various vegetation, and when that happens, notice the trees were dying, the soil quality was poor. So removing the wolves from Yellowstone seemed like a good idea for public safety, but it ended up decimating Yellowstone National Park, and they were later reintroduced to fix the problem. We'll talk about that. This is known as top-down regulation, can also be called a trophic cascade. Now, in ecosystems, you can likewise have bottom-up regulation, where if the prey population decreases and the vegetation can regrow, then you have more prey and more predators. In this case, we can see during a drought, there's poor growing conditions for the plants. That does not support as many elk, and it would not support many wolves. So you can actually see how food chains are quite dynamic in their regulation. Sometimes it's the predator, sometimes it's the environment. We'll also take a look at a case study that compares these two situations that we see in ecosystems. A dominant species is a species that's very abundant and has a high biomass in an ecosystem. So in this graph here, a dominant species would be plotted up here. They have a very high biomass, relative biomass, and again, that's just basically the mass of the living material, right? So these pine trees, these grazers, very high biomass in their ecosystems, very dominant, and they have a big impact on the ecosystem. Rare species tend to have low relative biomass and have less of an impact on other species around them, right? So obviously dominant species can outcompete and even competitively exclude others. Rare species tend not to do that, and these tend to be very vulnerable to things like extinction and so forth. A keystone species is kind of a combination of the two. They have a relatively low biomass in their ecosystem, but they have such a huge impact on the ecosystem as a whole and other species. I think a classic example of a keystone species is a beaver, because when a beaver is present in a forest, it will make a beaver dam. Well, when a dam is formed by beavers, it slows river flow, creates a pond, and now you can have more fish present in the pond, which brings in more birds. You can have different species of trees and aquatic plants growing around. So the biodiversity in a forest increases because of the presence of the beaver. If the beaver is removed, there's no dams, there's no ponds, the water just flows through. Overall biodiversity in the forest goes down. We see locally here in Florida, you may recognize this guy, the gopher tortoise is hugely important. It lives in the dunes along Florida beaches, and they dig burrows, and it's been estimated that hundreds of different species within sand dunes depend on the burrows of the gopher tortoise. So it is a protected species. That's why you're really not supposed to mess with these guys, because they're very, very important to our local ecosystem. The term keystone species comes from architecture. You may be familiar that in basic architecture, if you have a keystone, that is the stone that's at the top of an arch. And it's very important because if you remove that keystone, the whole arch would collapse. So sharks are now being understood to be very important keystone species in ecosystems. And so we can see this here in this example. When the sharks are present, They serve as apex predators and they limit the population of cow-nose rays. The cow-nose rays then feed on bivalves and arthropods, shrimp, crabs, etc. Everything is kind of maintained in this balance, this control, this top-down regulation from the shark. Well, many sharks are being removed from ecosystems due to overfishing, finning practices globally, and so we're seeing a loss of these important keystone species. Well, when the keystone is removed, the whole ecosystem kind of crumbles, the whole arch collapses, right? So overfishing decimates the shark population. That leads to an overpopulation of cow-nose rays, who then consume too many bivalve and arthropod populations and can cause them to collapse. And then there's the rebound effect, where now you'd have top or bottom up control. If there's fewer arthropods and bivalves, that'll support fewer cow-nose rays. So you can really see the ecosystem takes a huge hit when the important apex predators and other keystone species are not present. The understanding of a niche is interesting. We talked about that in a previous lesson. A niche is basically the functional role that a species occupies in its ecosystem. And we have, when we look more closely at that and we take the concepts we've learned in this lecture, competition and resource allocation, we start to see that the niche of species can be limited by species interactions. There's a concept known as, or a term that describes a fundamental niche. A fundamental niche is basically where a species could reside if there was no competition, right? So the important here is this is basically where the species could be, like how much of the niche it could occupy. Great example is seen here in barnacles. So here in this example we're looking at, this is one species of barnacle, pronounced thalamus. I believe the CH is just silent here. Well, if we look at their fundamental niche, when there's no competition, these guys can reside high on the high tide line all the way down to the low tide line. If you're not familiar with barnacles, barnacles are little crustaceans that encrust themselves onto rocks and they filter feed. And when the tide goes down, they close their shells so they don't dry out. Well, these little guys can occupy all the way to the lowest of the tide line all the way to the highest of the tide line. So again, quite a large fundamental niche. Now, a realized niche is the actual set of conditions that impose a species or limit a species distribution. So notice what we've done in the experiment now is we have introduced another barnacle known as semibalanus. Notice it's a little bit bigger and it is able to outcompete, or you can even say competitively exclude, thalamus from the low tide line. Now, the fundamental niche for semibalanus extends all the way up to about here, not all the way to the highest of the tide line because they can't handle that amount of desiccation or drying out. So notice what this has done to thalamus. Its realized niche is much smaller. They can still exploit and thrive high in the tide line, so their habitat or niche is really limited here by this competition. What could happen in the future is some other species like mussels, for example, which are a type of bivalve or clam-like organism, could come in and outcompete semibalanus lower on the tide line. And so we end up having this zonation of different niche occupation along a rocky intertidal. It's pretty interesting. When we look at these two terms, fundamental and realized niche is always smaller than fundamental, right? Fundamental is where a species could be present, but there's usually competitors and limiting other limiting factors that reduce the fundamental niche or the realized niche to a much smaller size. We're now going to focus on trophic roles and relationships. Basically, this is taking a closer look at who eats who in an ecosystem. So kind of a review and examples of some terms that we'll be discussing here. A producer is any organism that can convert inorganic molecules into energy. They produce biomass, they produce their own energy. So a classic example is any plant that can photosynthesize. They're taking inorganic carbon dioxide and turning it into carbohydrates. Consumers are those that eat the bodies of other organisms. Now there's a couple of different consumers. You can have a primary consumer, also known as an herbivore, that eats specifically producers. A secondary, tertiary, or quaternary consumer, also known as a carnivore, eat other consumers. Again, these would be like your predators. An omnivore would eat both producers and consumers, and humans are a good example of that. Parasites, as we talked earlier, they live on another organism or even inside it and just get energy, but the goal is not to kill like a predator would, because a parasite wants their host to live as long as possible so that they continue to benefit from it. A decomposer is anything that basically feeds on detritus. Detritus is decomposing organic material, and so these are very, very important in recycling nutrients. So bacteria and fungi tend to be decomposers. Detritivores will feed on both detritus and anything that's decomposing. So they're very similar, but decomposers, I guess the key difference is these bacteria and fungi are very important at breaking the detritus down into its basic elemental components, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, and recycling all that. Let's go ahead and apply these terms to their relationships. The most basic feeding interaction relationship we see in ecosystems is called a food chain, which is basically, it shows who is eating who in the passage of energy from one ecosystem to the next. So here in this basic food chain, we can see we've got phytoplankton in the ocean, diatoms and such. They are being consumed. The arrow is pointing to the consumer. It also represents the flow of energy. They're being consumed by krill, these small shrimp. The krill then are being consumed by the baleen whales here, right? However, this is a very simple model, and in ecosystems, it's rare to find just a simple food chain. Ordinarily, we see a very complex food web, which is many overlapping food chains. So the krill are not just consumed by whales, they're consumed by birds and fish. So there's a very, very dynamic interaction. Within food webs, we have trophic levels. These are the stages at which energy flows through ecosystems. And it's important to recognize that energy is going to flow in a one-way direction. And that's why the arrows in a food web are very important. They show the flow of energy, the direction in which energy is going. Now, at the bottom of our food web, we of course will have our producers. Those are the ones that are not consuming anything. They produce their own energy from photosynthesis, or it could be chemosynthesis, depending on the ecosystem. First level consumers, or primary consumers, would be the herbivores, those feeding on the producers. Then you have your secondary consumers, third or tertiary consumers, fourth level consumers, fifth level, and even sixth level. So you can see basically as you make your way up the food web, we're getting into different levels of consumers. It's also possible for an organism to occupy a couple of different levels on an ecosystem. So that's possible. Now, it's actually quite rare to see a food web that would have 6 levels like this. They tend to be limited to 3, 4, but you can have as many as 6. But why are the number of feeding levels limited like this? Well, there's an important explanation for that. Because energy is flowing through ecosystems in a one-way direction. So let's take a look at what we're learning by this diagram here. First of all, each trophic level, each of the feeding levels we looked at previously, producers, herbivores or primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, each contain a certain amount of energy. All the energy in the food web is initially captured by the producers. So plants, algae, cyanobacteria, they are capturing light, and they are producing energy, chemical energy for the food web by means of photosynthesis. Now, this is where thermodynamics comes into play. The second law of thermodynamics says that no energy transfer is 100% efficient. In ecosystems, the energy transfer tends to only be about 10% efficient. That means 90% of the useful energy that is captured for photosynthesis and incorporated into producers, 90% of it is wasted as heat or is lost to decomposition. Only 10% actually makes it on to the primary consumers. Only 10% of what's in the primary consumers makes it to the secondary consumers, because every step along the way, you're losing 90% of the available energy to heat, or we could also say entropy if you're familiar with thermodynamics. That's unusable energy, and also decomposers. So the inefficiency of energy transfer leads us to understand that when we look at a food chain, in a food web, we can also diagram it this way, as an energy pyramid. So this pyramid shows you the decrease in the available energy as you move up the food chain. So here we can see that the producer, which of course uses 100% of the energy that it uses, and in this case we're looking at the grass. Now, in this ecosystem, only 10% of that energy will make it to the herbivores. Then that would mean only 1% is available for the carnivores, and then 0.1% for the top predator or tertiary consumer in this, right? This diagram helps us to see two things. One, why we're losing energy. We're losing energy because of decomposition, and we're losing it to entropy or heat. We also see this reduction in energy leads to a reduction in biomass, and also reduction in population. So when you look at this ecosystem, for example, if we were to go out into a typical ecosystem, would you expect to see more grass or more hawks? Well, conceptually, hopefully you're understanding that you would expect to see like millions of blades of grass in a field and maybe one hawk, maybe two. It would be very odd to go and see maybe just 2 blades of grass and like 1,000 hawks flying overhead. That would be unusual and probably scary, right? Because your brain recognizes that that's not how nature operates. The greatest population in biomass in any ecosystem has to be occupied by the producers, because only 10% of what's in the producers will support the herbivores, and then only 1% for the secondary consumers, and only 0.1% for the hawks, right? Notice that there's only 10% energy transfer from one trophic level to the next. This is important when we look at many concepts in this class. This also helps us to understand why when we eat a plant-based diet, it actually requires less energy and conserves resources. Not to say we shouldn't eat meat from time to time, because we are omnivores, but many people are choosing a plant-based diet not only for its health benefits, but also because it saves energy. We'll talk more about that when we look at our impact on the environment. And again, biomass, I have used that term a couple of times, is basically the weight of living material. So if we look at these 4 trophic levels, which should have the highest biomass, it would be the producers, meaning if you took all the grass in this field and put it on a scale, it should be significantly higher than the biomass of the number of hawks in that field. Primary productivity is the rate at which those producers, plants specifically, are able to take inorganic energy and turn it into organic compounds. This is really, really important, because this is what supports food chains, right? So in order for humans to eat, we need to have plants available and other animals. Well, they're not going to be available if there's no primary productivity. So when we use the term producers, we can also use the term primary producers. And they're producers because they produce organic compounds, which then forms new biomass. Now, in this class, understanding primary productivity is really important. We're going to be doing a lab where we actually measure it. And there's a couple of associated terms. We have something called gross primary productivity, for short GPP, which is the total amount of energy that the plant captures, right? So here, this plant is capturing light, making sugar, growing, and so we call that the gross primary productivity. But it's important to remember that plants do photosynthesis and make sugar primarily for themselves, because they also need to do cellular work in the form of respiration. So this plant will use some of the sugar to grow, to do its life processes, etc. Now, a lot of plants will make extra sugar, and it's stored in their biomass. And some plants make a lot of sugar. Potato plants, for example, make so much sugar they convert it into starch and put it in a potato bulb underground as an energy storage organ. So because plants need to use some of the energy they produced, the amount of energy they store and that's left over is known as the net productivity. This is the energy remaining after the producers have taken what they need. And so the relationship between gross and net is this way. Net primary productivity is essentially the gross minus the respiration. These terms gross and net you may have heard before because they can be applied to your paycheck, and that might help you to understand this relationship a little bit better. So let's say you, for simplicity's sake, you earn $10 an hour and you work 10 hours at a job, okay? Now, that would mean your gross pay would be $100, right? So you work 10 hours, $10 an hour. Okay, so you're getting $100. However, if you're working for a company that is reporting taxes, well, your net pay is going to be lower. It may only be like $80. Why? Because taxes had to be taken out of it, right? So the gross pay is always higher than your net pay. And so in nature, the way we can look at this is gross primary productivity is the total amount of energy that's produced by plants, produced by the system. They need to tax that amount for their own biomass and growth, basically to provide infrastructure, right? Without trees growing, we don't have a forest, and there's no ecosystem for other organisms to benefit, right? So the ecosystems kind of have to tax gross primary productivity with their own respiration. What's left over, this net primary productivity, is what is available for the rest of the food chain. So this is important. So net primary productivity is significant because it's the available energy for herbivores and then in turn carnivores. And it is this amount, this net primary productivity, that is subject to the 10% rule. Only 10% makes it from one trophic level to the next. Now in lab, we're going to be measuring primary productivity. So how would you go about doing that? Well, one of the classic ways we do this is a process known as the light-dark bottle experiment. And so in the light-dark bottle experiment, we set up one clear glass bottle that has plants or algae in it. Well, what's going on inside that bottle? Well, clearly photosynthesis, right? Inside the bottle, the producers are taking the carbon dioxide that is dissolved in the water, turning it into sugar or organic molecules, right? This will produce a certain amount of oxygen as a byproduct of that, right? We know that, oxygen is one of the byproducts of photosynthesis. Okay, but is that the only thing, the only biochemical process going on inside this bottle? Well, no, because remember that algae or plants in the bottle also need to do respiration for their own cellular processes. They are using the organic matter and the oxygen they produce to do respiration, which produces water and carbon dioxide, and can kind of keep this cycle going. So this bottle really would give us a measure of the net productivity, not the gross. So how do we measure gross primary productivity? Well, we would have to set up a second bottle. In this case, we would set up a dark bottle where that does not allow any light to penetrate. So that means photosynthesis is shut down, but the algae are still doing respiration. They're living off the stores of organic matter and oxygen in the water. And so the oxygen is being used. So notice what's happening here is in the light bottle, we have oxygen produced by photosynthesis and oxygen being used by respiration. If we compare this to the amount of oxygen used in the dark bottle, now we get an idea of the total oxygen produced, or the gross primary productivity. We'll be doing something similar to this in our lab for this lesson. Now, when we look at productivity among biomes, it's interesting. Which of these biomes, these terrestrial ecosystems that you see here, do you think would have the highest productivity? Well, tropical rainforest is up there at the top, right? No doubt about that. So most of your forests are all super productive, and this makes sense. The plant biomass is through the roof, huge trees, lots of rain, great growing conditions, plenty of biodiversity. No surprise that a desert has very low productivity because there's very little water, there's very little plant life. So there's some, but not a lot. In aquatic ecosystems, we see that your swamps and marshes, your reefs, your salt marshes, all of these are very productive ecosystems. Some even rival and are more productive than rainforests. Whereas the open ocean, it has very little productivity because there's not many plants that are growing. There's a lot of phytoplankton, but it doesn't live very long. So there's not a huge biomass per square meter in the ocean, in the open ocean, of phytoplankton. What's interesting about the open ocean, though, is its productivity is very low, but because the open ocean is so vast, 71% of the planet Earth is covered by the ocean, it's such a huge overall contributor to productivity and oxygen. So this is why, maybe you've heard this before, that every second breath of oxygen you take is a result of the photosynthesis going on by the phytoplankton in the open ocean. So even though overall productivity is low, if we look at per square meter, since the ocean is so vast, its total productivity is quite high. Let's go ahead and review what we learned here with a few MCQ examples here. So here is an example of a multiple choice question that gives you a diagram. And here we're looking at a trophic pyramid, right? It's not like a true pyramid. They use these rectangles to show the decreasing biomass and energy and population, right? So now, based on the diagram, which group of organisms would be considered herbivores? Would it be snakes, mice, grasshoppers, or the grasses? Well, herbivores are also primary consumers, and they eat herbs or they consume plants, grasshoppers. Since this is the trophic level above grasses, this means they are consuming them. Now, second question, based on the laws of thermodynamics, specifically the second law, which of the following is the applied mathematical routine used to estimate the biomass of mice in the pyramid, right? So we know grasses make up 18,705 kilograms in this ecosystem. What we need to do is, okay, well, we know that only 10% of the energy and biomass in grasses will make it up to the grasshoppers. And then only 10% of what's there will make it up into the mice. So that is why the correct answer here is C. We're taking the mass of the plant, multiplying it by 10% or 0.1. If you do it just once, that takes you to the level for the grasshoppers. When you do it twice, it takes you up to the mice. So understanding how to use percents is very, very important in this example. Now let's take a look at an FRQ. Again, a diagram is presented here in a simple food web. Part A is asking you to refer to, well, I'm actually going to, before we go over, I'm going to tell you to pause the video and go ahead and try to answer this on your own and see how you do. Okay, let's go ahead and uncover the answers here. So part A is to refer to the food web above, complete the table. So you're asked to identify a primary producer, a primary consumer, and a secondary consumer. So here's the correct answer. The diatoms would be your primary producer. How do we know that? Well, hopefully you understand phytoplankton is a producer, or you could also figure this out by seeing there's no energy, no arrows flowing to the diatoms, meaning they're producing the energy. The energy is only leaving them to go to the primary consumer, which would be krill in this case. A secondary consumer could be either the cod or the ringed seal, right? Why? Because you go to the primary consumer and then there's the secondary. One step, two steps. One step, two step. Part B, other than showing which organisms are consumed by other organisms, describe what is indicated by the direction of the arrows, right? So the arrows do point to the consumers, but the arrows also show a couple other things, the flow of energy and the flow of biomass or matter in the trophic levels. Continuing here, as the amount of sea ice has decreased, larger expanses of the Arctic Ocean are now completely free of sea ice for several weeks each summer. Ring seals, the preferred prey of polar bears, we can see that here, come to holes in the sea ice to breathe. Describe how the change in sea ice habitat is affecting polar bears' ability to hunt and feed. Well, here's many possible answers to this, right? So you'd get a point for correctly describing, and notice it has to be a description, can't just be identification. But basically, if you're describing that there's a decreased area for hunting, it makes it more difficult for the polar bears to get their food. Or the polar bears had to exert more energy to find food, so they're tired and therefore have a hard time recouping that energy. There's increased stress, physiological stress, because the polar bears are not adapted to warmer temperatures. Could have gone with that. Or a fourth option, increasing the time between successful kills results in bears spending more time waiting for their next meal. So it's like the bears are being forced to go on a diet. They're consuming less and exercising more, and so that can harm them.